And of course, today he delivers a keynote on ethical business leadership to heal a divided country. And as I call him up, allow me to also say that the first 30 people who registered and paid for the conference have all received a signed copy of his book. So if you suspect you might be in that first 30 and you haven't received a signed copy as you were registering and your name didn't pop up, please come and visit us at the front and we'll certainly send you a book. My final line of introduction to this leader is a person who I have had the pleasure of interviewing over and over again on CNBC Africa, always knowing that when we had him on the desk, we were going to get insight that was going to give light and direction to what we needed to do as a country. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Mr. Bonang Mohale.
I want to remember your face so that when I meet you in heaven, I will be able to thank you once again. So these authentically simple but profoundly gravid words are spoken by a little girl who's just one of 200 to receive a wheelchair each from Nigeria's billionaire, Femi Otedole. As Femi prepares to leave, thinking that his job is done, the little girl clutches onto his legs. He looks down and he says, "Is there anything that I can do more for you, my little girl?" And she looks up and utters these truly life-changing words. And by so doing, gives Femi Otedole happiness for the first time in his life. By so doing, allows Femi to touch, hug, and feel real joy for the first time in his life, but by so doing, introduces this notion of transformative philanthropy. How can we give in a manner that transforms both society, but most importantly, the philanthropist? I have never met a poor philanthropist myself. In fact, there is no nobility in being poor. Isn't it amazing that 30 years into a democracy, poverty still has primarily a black and feminine face? You see, if wealth is the inevitable outcome of both hard work and enterprise, then every woman in Africa should be a dollar billionaire. I'm hoping that as a direct result of our conversation this morning, maybe, just maybe, as a direct result of our action, because leadership is personal, the same way that success is personal, that when we live here, we might just be in a position to release better humans as a direct result of our actions, not just what we say, but what we do. That maybe, just maybe, we might be able to release highly connected, active citizens that would help us solve some of our intractable problems. Maybe, just maybe, as a direct result of our conversation this morning, we might be able to have a full appreciation of this notion of leadership, that it has nothing to do with the title on a business card or the corner office, but it's anybody that feels called upon to lead is a leader. That leadership is the other-centered, not self-centered. That it is a privilege to improve the quality of lives of others, not an opportunity to enrich self. That we'll really have an appreciation that doing good is good for everyone. That especially because I'm talking to business people. That business itself cannot continue to be an island of prosperity in a sea of poverty. That it can be that the richest square mile in the continent happens to be Sandton, but just 2 kilometers across the bridge, you have Alexander, 680,000 people in a 6-kilometer area, wallowing in the surplus of their own poverty, in the midst of self-perpetuating vicious cycle of this abject poverty, subjected to the violence and the brutality of just not having. When we, you and I, can do something to ensure that we open up spaces for the majority of our people just to participate, not even to reach their fullest potential, just to reclaim their self-worth and self-respect. So that we can really enjoy the meaning of what it is to be truly human. That ego is the enemy of leadership, the same way that panic is the enemy of progress. That vulnerability is strength, and arrogance, it's a camouflage for insecurity. That it is okay for us as men also to show our emotion, and from time to time to cry, because it's the most natural thing that we can possibly do, rather than believing the so 20s message that tigers don't cry. That all of us can help each other and one another deal with our collective trauma. That maybe, just maybe, we might collectively graduate from humankind to being kind humans, from important people to being people of significance, because we are no more human than when we connect. Khalil Gibral reminds us that those that are helping others are completing God's work, that no successful person has ever reached there on their own, that we all need each other and one another. But it's also fascinating that you choosing to invest in your own personal growth and development at this time, in this country, in this season, when so many of us dare to hope that joy and peace will prevail. Umshengu Sisnozipo says, let's also exercise our independent mind 15 days from now and ensure that we go and make our important acts. In Australia, if you don't vote, you go to prison. In this country, it should be much dire than that, because people died and they paid the supreme sacrifice so that we can exercise this choice, so that we're not the loudmouths complaining about the type of leadership that we have inherited, when you could have chosen the type of leadership that you want, that you've earned, that you deserve. But also at the time that probably we are caught in the midst of 2 wars, 2 global wars, threatening to suck in the entire Middle East, where Egypt also for the first time joined South Africa in the ICJ. When Russia and China are saying, we hope that you, the US, and your 51st state is not going to interfere. Because if you do, then we will. Maybe, just maybe, we might be on the cusp of the Third World War, depending on the decisions taken by our leaders. But we see the effect because the supply chains are interrupted. If you drive a car today, you take it to a dealership, it is possible that if you order a component, it might just take 6 weeks because the Suez Canal from time to time gets blocked. The Strait of Hormuz also does not allow the movement of hydrocarbons, where we import 30 billion liters of liquid fuels. 20 billion of them we used to refine in this country. Only 10 billion we use just to import as finished product. That buffer is now gone when most of these ships are actually quite concerned to drive around the West Coast, finding it much easier to drive all the way to the Cape, probably adding another 21 days in their journey because of safety and security concerns. But also having this conversation at a time that we as a people are confronted even with new nomenclature. Load shedding, water shedding. This incident that started on the 2nd of February in 2008, that in 16 and a half years we have not been able to solve. And it's not useful now when we are led to believe that we can actually end load shedding by the end of this year, when we were promised that it might end by December of 2023. Because if you do the math, you'll realize that actually what we are confronted with is not only a systemic, but also a systematic gap that we have not been able to close. This entity called Eskom, that was created by Van der Bijl as one of the three things that he created. The IDC was another, ISCOR was the third, with 57 gigawatt of nameplate electricity. That in our best days, through our 20 power stations, we don't even get 27 gigawatts of electricity. So the gap between this that we generate and the peak demand is 6 gigawatts. That's all it is, 6,000 megawatts of electricity. So what we have failed to do is to think deeply and profoundly about what we are going to do when we inherit this one of the more than 734 state-owned enterprises. Because we knew that we wanted to build 4 million more houses that will need to be electrified. We knew that we wanted to electrify at a rate of 10,000 households a day, every day, from the time that Dr. Ruel Khoza was the chair of this entity, and it won the best utility in the world, and it had a rating higher than sovereign. So the CSIR, together with the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, led by Ntate Gwede Mantashe, does a piece of work. And they tell us that in 2022, because these are audited figures, they measure the cost of unserved electricity. And both of them put this figure at 6.4 gigawatts. At 80 rand per megawatt, in 2022, the economy lost 570 billion rands into our GDP. When we reach stage 6 load shedding, we lose 4 billion rands a day between stages. That's 500 million rand a day, every day. In the last 10 years, as a direct result of lack of electricity, because it is our fourth means of production when land is our primary means of production. We have wiped off an average of 2 percentage points in our GDP. The highest GDP growth we've ever achieved was in the 43 consecutive quarters of positive GDP growth when we had our second democratically elected president, Thabo Mbeki, in October of 2007. And ever since then, we have never reached anything close to that. But we know that our population growth is 1.5%. And yet in the last 10 years, this economy has never grown by more than 2 percentage points. So what it means in simple English is that your discretionary purchasing power and your disposable income, and mine as well, has been going backwards. We buy less for the same amount of rents today compared to the same period 10 years ago. And to talk a little bit about watershedding, spare a moment for the community of Hammanskraal, not far from here, who not for 20 months, but for 20 years, have not had running water. Simply because of just two things. One is ailing infrastructure. Number two, this notion of planned and preventative maintenance. That's all it is. And the best vaccine against cholera is just those two things. Clean running water and a toilet that flushes. 30 years into democracy, we should want more. We should aspire for more. And that is the job of real leaders who look at themselves in the mirror every day to say, is there anything that I personally can do just to ensure that I can make my neighbor better off today compared to yesterday? Because my grandmother teaches me that when your neighbor is hungry, you cannot sleep at night. Not your neighbor. You cannot sleep at night. So before I shut up and take some questions and comments, Mshengu Nkosi yami, may I leave them with just one challenge? So I spoke about 2022 and the piece of work that is done by DMRE, but Department of Higher Education and Training, led by Dr. Blade Nzimade, also does a piece of work. Because I used 2022, let me share with you the 2022 figures. They remind us that we have 26 public universities, 1.2 million students in those 26 public universities. If we were to educate every single solitary one of them on a fee-free basis, that will cost us 50 billion South African rands. If we looked at only those that a combined household income is less than 350,000 rands, it will be 20 billion rand. But they also remind us that there's this small problem called historical debt. They put that figure at 16.5 billion, 9.2 billion of which is irrecoverable. So if I leave the 3.5 million small and medium enterprises, because those are survivalist by nature, hand to mouth, and I start with only 1.5 million medium-sized companies that have a turnover of 300 million and above, and I look at the 400 companies that are listed on the JSE in 2010, the number today is 289. And in particular, I focus on the 60 companies that hold securities in 80 private equity firms. All of them, without fail, have a corporate social investment program. 98% of them have 4 focus areas. 100% of them in those 4 focus areas, one of them at least has to do with education. So if we look at these companies in the centerpiece of the peoples of their eyes, and we don't even ask them to make more profits or to increase their business footprint, and we simply say, take the money that has already been approved by your board, and put it in this historical debt fund. A measly, no less than 1 million rand per company. Not in 30 years, but in 1 year, would have wiped off the entire 16.5 billion historical debt, because we dared to have some sort of a compelling vision. We had the courage of our conviction. And by so doing, we give not future leaders, but today's leadership a little bit of hope to ensure that they don't have to suffer the indignity of food insecurity and period poverty. It was our first democratically elected President, Rolihlahla Nelson Mandela, who said, education matters because it's the shortest way in which one can transcend social classes. Born poor in Alexander after 23 years of hard work and application, you're able to afford a house in the leafy suburbs of Bryanston. Not because you won a tender, but because you have earned it, you can afford it, and you deserve it. Education matters because when one steadily burns the midnight oil, one gains access to the domain of knowledge and wisdom, the world of meaning, the world that cannot be conquered without a persistent crusade. Unscrupulous politicians hate educated blacks because educated blacks make it impossible to be fooled by unscrupulous politicians. If we did that and did only that, Mshengu Nkosi yami, maybe, just maybe, we might be able to usher in a better future for our children so that they can fight their own wars rather than looking at ourselves in the mirror and saying, clearly we were so eager to get into political office, not to be in power, that we didn't think deeply and profoundly about what is it that we're going to do when we get this freedom to change fundamentally the structure of this economy. Very much like a dog chasing a car without much thought to say, but what if it stops? What would I do then? That we haven't changed the fact that this economy is still premised just on three things: providing a crucible of cheap labor forever, and that our forebears can go to the belly of the earth and dig for the gold, risk it all. But when it comes up, that the UK will have the first right of refusal. That will go to the belly of the earth and bring up these diamonds. But the one who is the buyer will determine the price. Hence the creation of the London Sales Organization. The day we change that as Africans, maybe, just maybe, we will then be able to achieve our proper nirvana. Because 57, with Ghana be free, with Kwame Nkrumah, we blamed colonialism for our poverty that they stole and pillaged. But in the last 60 years, the people who've made us poorer are those that are our very own, that steal from their children, from the monies due to their education, and PPE money that's supposed to buffer them against the pandemic. Ngiyabonga Nkosi yami.
I'm going to ask you to, if you don't mind, take a seat with me for a few minutes and
Yes, boss.
maybe take a few questions. And I'd love not to keep him to myself. So I've got a couple of devices with me here. One of these devices allows me to see your questions, right? So I'm gonna have a little bit of moderator superpower and pose the first question myself. But I'm then going to turn to my iPad and hopefully get one or two questions from both our physical and online audience. And let me start off by saying thank you for the provocation and the challenge. I think the question is loud and clear. Is there anything that I can do? You started off by saying that leadership is personal, and that deeply personal question stands out. I want to ask this question, and I think I want to build on the call to action from Kathy when she was encouraging us to go to the polls. How do we ensure that we are able, especially corporates who care, to use a phrase that Kathy used, rise above the social divisions, and to ensure that we are not only encouraging those who are part of our corporate community, but the communities within which we operate, to understand the responsibility and the weight of that responsibility, to go and participate in the election, to bring about the South Africa that we deserve? What is the role of corporates in that?
So the first is maybe to appreciate that South Africa is a story of two halves. The first half, we did some truly amazing, phenomenal things. The creation of SARS, for instance,
Yeah.
and many institutions that are very resilient. And then the last half is when the wheels came off, when our leaders succumbed to greed, state capture, bribery, stealing, and cheating. So imagine if companies stopped financing political parties and individuals for the first time in the history of our country, commensurate to their representation.
Yeah.
But simply thought about the 4, no more than 5 things that are important to us, that would usher in a new dawn. Because all the countries that have gone through the same trauma that we have gone through,
Yeah.
I'm talking about Japan and Germany after the Second World War. But South Korea and even Singapore,
Yeah.
that was jettisoned by its own parent, Malaysia. Only in 20 years, they received aid. After 20 years, they were giving aids.
Sure.
In Africa, 60 years later, our leaders are holding conferences about how to better ask for a new form of aid. So if we thought deeply and profoundly about that and said, but what are these things that are going to change our life? Number one, I would say transformation, so that we vote for those parties and individuals that commit to this, and corporates fund only those. Transformation. Because if this economy doesn't look like us, it's not sustainable and therefore not going to be resilient.
Yeah.
Because surely in Africa, resilience has to be much more than the food, water, energy nexus. Number 2, ethical leadership.
Yeah.
Number 3, good governance. Number 4, service delivery. Because that's their job description.
Yeah.
It's actually contained in chapter 198 of our constitution. And that's why we say our constitution is the best in the world. Not because of what's in the main body of the constitution,
Right.
but because of what is only in the one page, the preamble to the constitution. Because to me, it embodies everything. Lastly, which I think is most important, it's law and order, safety and security.
Sure.
Because without law and order, safety and security, who are we and what are we? When we are not safe in the streets, we can almost understand that. But we're not safe in our own homes.
Yeah.
When the walls are higher, the electric volt is 220 and we're wanting to yank it up. We are the most stressed people in the world. Coming this morning, I was listening to a parliamentary answer to a question that was raised to say in 5 years we lost 5 million dockets. I did the math in my head and said, but that's 3,000 a day, every day. And we have 180,000 police women and men.
Yeah.
What are they doing if not to keep their own children safe?
I think it's an incredible answer because it gives us almost clear pathways to where the change and the systemic change opportunities lie. You talk about transformation, ethical leadership, good governance. You talk about law, order, and security. I want to maybe bring a question I've got 2 questions that have coming through, and I think lots more still on the way. But Sophie's question, I think, links to what you've just shared with us. And Sophie says, Bonang, how do we make big, bold changes at a systemic level? Because once we start thinking systemic, it just becomes so big. And you lose sight of it because it's oftentimes requires patience and a long-term view. But Sophie's question is, just take us to the first step. What is the first step to making sure that you're not fiddling at the edges, playing with the visible symptoms of the problem, but you're getting to the root of the systemic change? What's the first step?
So I suppose, like everything else, it starts with a unit of civilization, which is the family. Now we outsource even parenting to teachers, when we should be giving them values that will stand them in good stead. How do we ensure that our children have their true north? And the best way to do that is not to tell your kids what to do, is to be exemplary. Because if you are a man and you live a life of purpose, meaning maybe, just maybe, your son might want to emulate that so that your daughter might marry it. Because sons learn to be men by looking at the back of the heads of their fathers.
Yeah.
It's not monkey here, monkey do.
It's monkey see. I've got 5 minutes and I want to ram in as many questions as I can. So I'm going to try and paraphrase some of the questions. Lebogang says, I want to get straight to the point. How do we ensure that corporates are not in it for BEE points?
It's when business realizes that we need to continue to do well by doing good.
Yeah.
Because business is not our second chance. It's our last chance. But business itself needs to be steered back, because what is needed, it's bold, incisive leadership to ensure that we don't have the Steinhoffs, the Tonga Hewlett,
Yeah.
a 100-year-old institution that, because of the greed of one man, Peter Steady, who was the CEO, and his ESCO of 8, they lost 150 billion rands. That we don't have the KPMGs, the Mackenzies, the Bain and Company, who actively participated in agitating and orchestrating the deepest form of state capture in destroying SARS, that we created ourselves to be one of the top 5 collection agencies in the world by merging these 4 entities,
Yeah.
the Department of Revenue, Collections, and Expenditure, and we created this truly world-class model.
Gordon says, I hear your pathways and what we can do, but what about state capacity and spatial exclusion? What advice would you give leaders to really help us address the capacity of the state to meet its promises, and to really think about how spatial exclusion translates into opportunity exclusion, economic exclusion, and all other types of exclusion?
Maybe just 2 things. One, imagine if business was a trusted advisor. 2, to be a partner of choice, to do everything in its power to make sure that this ANC-led government currently becomes a capable state. Because business has learned that it's better to deal with a capable state than the one that is less capable. Lastly, there's almost 62 million of us.
Yeah.
Since the last census. 51% consists of women, and that women's representation in positions of leadership is less than 24%. African women, less than 4%. So instead of talking about gender equality and pay parity, what if we implemented social justice? Because we know that when you put a smartphone in the hands of a woman, not only does the education and nutrition of their own children improves, but of the entire society from which they come. COVID taught us many things. One of the things it taught us is that of the 197 countries that are affected and infected by this 1 in 100-year pandemic, 8 dealt better with the pandemic than all others. And all 8 of them were led by women as heads of state, including New Zealand and its 5 million people, Germany's Angela Merkel, and the Scandinavian and Nordic countries when you add one more.
Final question comes from Warren. And Warren says, what if you had a magic wand and you wave that wand? What is the one issue that you think if we put our all behind it as a country, it would have a domino effect in helping us gain momentum to be able to address the plethora of challenges that we face?
I would say it's transformation.
Transformation.
Because think about it. This economy must look like us. That's the only way we can build short-term sustainability in order to build long-term resilience. Transformation. Because when all of us feel like we've got something to lose, then we'll protect it like our whole life depends on it. Our forebears, when they went to Codesa 1, which collapsed, and then Codesa 2, they didn't come there so much because of what they could get out of the table.
Yeah.
But they came prepared to give up something. Do the math. Edward Kieswetter, this last financial year, ended 29th of February 2024, collected 2 trillion rands.
Sure.
The same period last year, he collected 2 trillion rands, but after VAT refunds to companies and individuals, he still banked 1.687 trillion rands. So South Africa is not a poor country. Africa is not a poor continent, just poorly managed. So if you say over 10 years, he collects on average 1.4 trillion, divide that by 62 million people, there's no reason why anybody should go to bed hungry.
Ladies and gentlemen, there's no reason why anybody should go to bed hungry. Let's give Mr. Bonang Mohale a big round of applause. Thank you so much. What an electrifying way to open the Business in Society Conference 2024. Business is our last chance. And there's so many other powerful statements that were made in that keynote that I really encourage you to go onto the app, put it into the chat. We are looking for your insights, your key ideas that are coming through. Notate it for yourself in your notebooks. Go and reflect on a little bit of some of those provocations that we heard today. My personal provocation that I heard was, our children will not blame colonization. Our children will not even blame apartheid. Our children will blame us. So, I'd like for you to also rate this session. So if you have a look again,